Okay, I think we can get started now already. Um, Thank you for joining. Thank you to our speakers who are here today. My name is Ailish, and I'll be moderating the event today. Special thank you also to Harm Reduction International for use of their for the Twitter account to host this space on. Um, the event will take a sort of structured Q&A format, and if possible, we'll also try to open the floor at the end. I'll firstly introduce our speakers, our panelists. Ajeng Larazati, excuse me, Ajeng. Ajeng Larazati is the human rights lead at Harm Reduction International. She's been working on the issue of the death penalty for more than a decade, where she represented some of death row inmates in Indonesia. Currently, she is leading Harm Reduction International's work to abolish the use of the death penalty for drug offences, including by monitoring the practice worldwide through HRI's flagship publication, The Death Penalty for Drug Offences Global Overview. Asia Humaida, I hope I've gotten that right, works for LBH Masyarakat, a legal aid organization based in Jakarta, Indonesia. She provides legal assistance and carries out advocacy around LBHM focus areas, including the death penalty abolition and drug policy reform. And finally, we have Dobby Chu, who is the executive coordinator of the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network, or ADPAN. ADPAN is a regional network of organizations and individuals committed to working towards abolition of the death penalty in the Asia-Pacific region. Their role is to create wider societal support for abolition of the death penalty in the Asia-Pacific region through advocacy, education, and network building. And ADPAN's vision is to bring about a death penalty-free Asia-Pacific. Today's event has been co-organized along with the organizations of our speakers by the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and RIN, the Women in Harm Reduction International Network. So the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, firstly HRI, ADPAN, and LBHM are members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, a network of more than 160 organizations committed to abolishing the death penalty. This Twitter space, co-organized by the World Coalition, is part of its commitment to make visible the gender and intersectional discrimination at work in judicial proceedings leading to the death penalty. If you're interested in the World Coalition's work on this subject, you're invited to visit their website, worldcoalition.org, and I think you can also see their Twitter account as one of the co-hosts or speakers on this event. I'm delighted to be moderating this event as the coordinator of RIN. My name is Ailish Brennan, and RIN is a global network aimed at expanding harm reduction approaches for women and people of diverse gender identities. We are co-organizers of this event, and it falls during our campaign to end violence against women who use drugs, running from November 25th to December 10th, alongside the global UN campaign to end violence against women. We began this campaign in an effort to draw attention to the disproportionate violence faced by women who use drugs and the lack of consideration given to our community by the broader feminist movement. Women who use drugs or whose lives involve drugs in some way are subject to multiple forms of violence, often at the hands of the state or state actors, and this includes the death penalty, which the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions recognizes can constitute a form of femicide. So, without further ado, I'll open up the discussion to our very impressive panelists. So, for a long time, the stories of women facing the death penalty were absent and invisible. In recent years, however, we've had access to information about the gender bias at work in capital punishment. We can, for example, think of the CCDPW 2018 and 2021 studies, with one from 2021, especially on women sentenced to death for drug-related offences. This first question is for Ajeng. Could you tell us more about the information available on the gender discrimination faced by women sentenced to death for drug trafficking? Over to you, Ajeng.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ailish. Well, as you said, when we talk about death penalty, in particular, death penalty for drug offenses, there are certain groups of populations that are more vulnerable to it. And one of them is women. Globally, it is estimated that at least 500 women are currently on death row, and women's incarceration rate have increased at a disproportionately higher rate than men. HRI have touched on this issue in our global overview, but I also want to um, highlight some other works that has been done by World Coalition, the Cornell University, and other researchers on particularly these issues. And it is from these various research that I would like to touch on three aspects um, that I think relevant to our conversation today. First of all, gender vulnerability can motivate women's involvement in the drug trade. In this world where access to education is not equal, and also access to other economic, social, and cultural rights are not equal, women are often have less access to education, which often resulted in their ability to access full-time, well-paid work. On the other hand, gender vulnerability also often put women in a carrying responsibility to provide or protect their family. The need for financial stability and ability to caring could motivate women to be involved in a drug trade. And by way of examples are the three Iranian women who were single mothers from low socioeconomic backgrounds, who were executed in Iran for drug offenses a few years back. The second aspect that I would like to talk about when it comes to women vulnerability to death penalty for drug offenses is women's socioeconomic background, which often puts them in a vulnerable place to be coerced into smuggling drugs. We maybe like most of us are familiar with the story of Mary Jane Veloso or Mary Utami, who were tricked into smuggling drugs for different reasons. A report from Cornell University highlighted that migrant domestic workers, many of them are women, by the way, are easy targets for syndicate because they are often from low socioeconomic background and have had poor access to education. Meanwhile, other research illustrates that women are vulnerable to threats and pressures from intimate partners, which in some cases led to them being coerced into drug trafficking with or without them knowing. And the third aspect is that women who are arrested or enter criminal justice system are vulnerable to further exploitation by the system that put them at a higher risk of being sentenced to death. They are vulnerable to sexual exploitation by the law enforcement officers. They are vulnerable to having lack of access to legal representations because oftentimes they find themselves in a situation where they don't know how to access the legal aid, for example. Also, they are they are at risk of receiving higher punishment despite their low level their low-level roles in the drug trade, because they are at the front line of the drug trade. They are the ones that are actually visible doing trafficking or trade, and they are also vulnerable to being punished harsher for not conforming to the gender value of being a nice, a kind woman. In some of the cases that I represented in the past, one of the elements that the judge considered in giving higher punishment, death sentence for women involved in the drug trafficking, is because they are not, um, as a woman, they should have not been involved in a drug trade. So it is another level of um, having to confirm to the social standard of being a nice woman. A nice woman doesn't get involved with drugs. Um, I'll stop there, and I hope it gives a good start to the conversation.
Thank you, Ajeng, for that detailed answer. Um, so next question is for Aisha. Uh, Based on the information shared by Ajeng on the general and global situation of women sentenced to death for drug trafficking, could you tell us how this echoes the situation specifically in Indonesia?
Yes, thank you. Ajeng have been addressing drug trafficking in general and little context about Indonesia actually, and I will divide Indonesia situations by 2 points: the crime itself and the subject. So in general, Indonesia death penalty mostly comes from narcotics, murder, and terrorism. Specifically for women, currently there are 12 women on death row, which is sometimes dominated by narcotics, but now mostly women on death row are come from murder cases. There is different stigma regarding narcotic cases and murder. It's about the crime itself that I mentioned before. First, the motivation for committing murder is more easily accepted by the public. I'm not saying is it to defend a woman who murdered her husband because of the violence he experienced. However, providing an understanding of the concept of underpacer or force majeure concept in murder cases is easier than in narcotic case. Discussing the concept of underpacer in narcotics often refuted with arguments why not run, why not escape. Then the worst is actually this is a simple but it often become a rebuttal. So when women not run or not escape from the smuggling from another country, from one country to another, so the judge or the people or the public Indonesia will ask them by, said you are trapped and had no knowledge what was in your bag because you are caught. So when we are not caught, you wouldn't mention that you are trapped by narcotic dealer. So situations regarding uh, criminal acts with the same punishments I talked about, murder and narcotic has different stigma in Indonesia. Even though when we talk about victim, narcotic is often faced with the immeasurable victim, totally different with the murder who has real victim about the crimes. But this is precisely what is burdensome in narcotic context. And the second is about the subject. I wanted to say women who calk and at airports because of their belongings contain narcotics have little chance of getting light sentence because the process of smuggling narcotics is very clearly visible. This is why foreign citizens in Indonesia are more vulnerable than national. Foreigners who calk at the airport, whether with the motivations of not knowing what is in their bag or swallowing narcotics due to coercions, are always considered to have fulfilled the intention to violate narcotics. And I also want highlight xenophobia situation in Indonesia. We are not the country who has sophisticated technology, but we have a pretty high number of foreign presence. So Indonesia has racist against African, even Latino, especially for um, Malaysian Chinese or Hong Kong Chinese, and it stayed in some our court decisions. For the example, why do Chinese people do when they go to Indonesia besides selling narcotics, and what African or black people do beside committing crime. So it's combined between the crimes and the subject to put them in high sentence situations. And yeah, so the situations Indonesia, why especially for women become exacerbated because the narcotics itself, it always dominated by men perpetrators, as Ajeng mentions before, because it's women and they didn't have good behavior, so that's why easy to get sentenced by that penalty. Maybe that's all for the first.
Thank you very much. And yeah, also interesting to hear the intersections of race and gender coming into the situation in Indonesia. Dobby, I'll move to you now and ask you the same question for Malaysia. You can give us some background to women who have been sentenced to death in the country and what discrimination they've faced.
Sure, thank you. Unfortunately for us in Malaysia, we really don't have a lot of granular details about women on death row. We have the kind of broad strokes or the kind of broad data around it. So for context, like earlier when Ajeng started, she mentioned there's about 500 women on death row around the world. If that statistic is accurate, Malaysia is host to about a fifth of them. So about almost 10% of our population on death row are women. And of that proportion, a significant chunk are actually foreign nationals who are on death row, and they make up most of the cases. Most of them are drug trafficking, almost exclusively drug trafficking. And the other women you see on death row are Malaysia, are a small minority of Malaysians who are there mostly for the offense of murder, a capital offense. Now, when we look at the kind of small granular cases that we have, we see drug trafficking with very similar story for what Aisha mentioned, the kind of vulnerability as a human to human traffickers, to drug trafficking syndicates are usually overlooked. You have murder offenses where our recognition of PTSD is still very, very much from 50, 60 years ago, if we recognize it at all. So unless you have a clean psychotic break as an offender, there's no recognition at all for whatever conditions or state of mind that resulted in you committing an act, even when you are a victim yourself. So, and these are things that we can see. For example, just a couple of years ago during pandemic, there was a lady from the UK who, unfortunately, got into a fight with her husband. The husband was quite a frequent, abuser, and she was for a long time a victim of domestic abuse. She defended herself that night and led to his death. There was no recognition or conversation at all on how that experience as a victim of domestic violence has affected her and has led to that moment. For a good amount of time, she was actually charged and actually treated as a murderer before her lawyer was successfully able to raise a defense that reduced it to essentially manslaughter. Now, we are undergoing this resentencing since for a while now, which I think I will go into a lot more detail later on. But essentially, when we look at it now, we are seeing cases where a woman who is about 70 years old being released after serving 19 years in prison for murder. And when you think about the kind of age, the kind of condition they're in, then you kind of realize there's a lot more to this that we haven't really found out yet. And at PEM, we're still trying to find out more about it. So maybe in the future, when we talk about this topic again, we'll have more to share. I'll leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dobby, and yeah, it really highlights the need for more data to be available and more information to be had about these women sentenced to death. Aisha, moving back to you, could you tell us how, as a lawyer, you develop a gender-sensitive defense and approach to your work, and how important this is?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I don't have standard way of doing defense. No, it's no. What so? Um, what I mean here is I use a different approach in each case, especially those of foreign national, because there definitely have sociocultural different factors that I don't understand apart from poverty and educations. But I will always start with an assessment to find out what vulnerabilities made them involved in narcotic case. Um, I always voices this vulnerability at every opportunity I have, start from uh, police investigations until law proceeding in the court. Regardless, it will be acknowledged or listened. I don't care about the result, but I keep saying because I never found reason for gender vulnerability to be considered to be considerations that reduce the sentence, even though the sentence finally lower than prosecutor charge. Then the seconds I will look for support the vulnerability factors such as research or witness or experts, and I will also thanks to many research that I use from HRI or from the project in Cornell University. Um, then okay, I will continue to the point. So um, I won't say this easy, not easy to always saying about the gender factors in assisting cases, but sometimes when we always think things repeatedly and make the listener know it, and finally they will interested to exploring it, and this is the thing I always do. So then the another problem in this situation is sometimes women facing coercion situations, then when it brought to the court it's too abstract to deliver to the judge, especially for the psychological coercions. It's hard to make it them understand about the coercion situations. And I also not trying to insult my country situations, but most judges here, especially at the first level, don't have much time to study, especially to read. So to answer the questions how to build a gender sensitive defense is be an annoying lawyer. We may lose an oral argument because the court's arrogance, but we still have room to counter it in written defense. This is also something that I do often. Uh, as a conclusions, um, I also want to emphasize that gender sensitive approach has been proven to prevent women from being sentenced to death. So then let's mainstream it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that insight. Um, Dobby, moving back to you. In Malaysia, the minister in the Prime Minister's Department of Parliament and Law, Wan Junaidi Tuanku Jafar, said that the government has agreed to abolish the mandatory sentence of the death penalty for certain crimes. Could you enlighten us on how this decision will change the situation for women facing the death penalty in the country, and explain to us how important it is that the criminal justice system takes full account of any mitigating factors related to women's backgrounds in sentencing?
Sure. So there's actually twofold to this. So one, of course, is the capital offense, and then there's drug trafficking one. We actually abolished the mandatory drug trafficking in 2018, but the effect of it has not really been felt since then. But what changed in our current abolition of all the mandatory sentencing include a review of that discretionary part. So now judges are no longer fettered or restricted by any form of legal scope when they say if they want to sentence someone to life imprisonment. Now, off the get-go, this means a lot of kind of defense that we have seen being ineffective in the past, especially for drug trafficking. They usually use this defense of innocent carrier. that they have no realization or understanding that what they're carrying is drugs, and there's no room for the kind of defense of intimidation or being coerced into a drug trafficking situation. So now these things will come in, and it will give a really good opportunity for those people who are facing a criminal charge for drug trafficking to have an alternative leeway. It may not be enough for them to escape conviction because of the kind of legal framework around conviction is still the same, but at least they will not be on death row. Now, whether that's a fair approach, now that leaves a lot to be wanted, because if you think about it, if someone is coerced into drug trafficking, and they're still convicted, even if they're not on death row, it is still unfair. If they are innocent carrier, the same thing still applies. Even it's still unfair manifestly, right? So there's still a lot of underlying changes that needs to happen. It's a bit better now because people are not sentenced to death, but it definitely does not fully capture the kind of needs there are. So for murder offenses, it's very much the same, right? We are still not recognizing or explicitly recognizing the kind of mitigating factors that are there. There's no indication whatsoever in the law itself. Granted, there is some discourse around it in Parliament, so there are some contextual discussion what the most serious crime would mean, when the death penalty should be merited, and that could be referred to by judges, but that's not really what we call a compelling bit that they must follow. And we have started resentencing people. We are on day 3 right now. There's been 3 cycles of resentencing involving about 30 individuals, and most of them so far, regardless of the kind of crime they have committed, be it for drug trafficking or murder, all of them have been resentenced to life imprisonment. So that does give a fairly good indication where the judiciary is likely going to go, because none of these cases are cases where we'll say it's exceptionally violent or exceptionally cruel. They are quite run-the-mill. Even the capital offense cases, they were crime of passion more than anything else. So most of these people have been imprisoned for life, but there's no examination of their context. So we could look at this 2 ways, right? Optimistically, we could say, regardless of mitigating circumstances, Malaysia is now looking at the death penalty as the rarest of the rare. We're not going to use it unless it crosses a certain threshold. At the same time, we can also say, yeah, we completely failed to address the kind of mitigating circumstances that should have even potentially overturned a conviction as opposed to just reducing a sentence. So that's kind of where we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dobby. Ajahn, moving to you. Could you share with us some of the alternatives to death sentences and prison sentences in general that Harm Reduction International has been working on?
So for us, there is no alternative to death sentence, right? Like there should be no death sentence at the first place. But we understand that in the context of drug policies, where in many parts of the world, the kind of policy applied is the harsh, punitive policy. This needs to change first. We need to change the way we shape our drug policy. The current approach to drug policy, which includes the use of the death penalty for drug offenses, has been proven as a failure. It has failed. The OHCHR latest report stated that unnecessary and disproportionate use of criminal justice system, including this one, the death penalty, led to exponential growth of prison populations and prison overcrowding. The UN High Commissioner also mentioned that decades of punitive war on drugs strategies had failed to prevent an increasing range and quantity of substances from being produced and consumed. And the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention study on drug policy stated that war on drugs is a war on people. Is a war on women, as it is often greatest on those who were poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. So, because we know that this is failing, we need to change the approach to drug policy in general, and push for countries to abolish the use of the death penalty for drug offenses, because it is not only um, failed, it is also a human rights violations, or the other way around. It is not just a human rights violations, but it has also been proven as unsuccessful in achieving whatever these countries trying to achieve, the so-called zero drugs states, whatever. Uh, so I guess alternative to death sentences is really changing the drug policy in the country, and making sure that that death penalty is not applied to drug offenses in the first place.
Thank you, Ajang. Yeah, thank you for your insight into HR's work and very important work. I'm now going to move to some open questions to all of the panelists. We have a little bit of time, and it also seems like there's no function for opening a Q&A session to the floor, so apologies to the listeners. But yes, so any of the panelists, feel free to jump in on this. When we talk about gender discrimination, I work in capital punishment. We mainly today and in general, of course, talk about women sentenced to death, but there's also the broader impact on friends, families, wives, daughters, and mothers of people sentenced to death. Women are often the ones carry out the work of care, and in the context of accompanying people sentenced to death, this has a major impact on their lives. Could any of you tell us more about the links you make between gender discrimination and the death penalty when we think of those around people sentenced to death?
I can start. I think for us,
Thank you.
we've been working very closely to about a group of 130 death row families, especially in the recent year, with the aim of trying to provide them the support or the kind of capacity to be able to do advocacy to support those on death row, and to also really take part in this resentencing process, right? For them to have that sense of ownership. And I think when we look at the kind of group that we work with, I can count the number of men who are leading the advocacy for their family members or their friends or their siblings who are on death row. There's definitely less than 10 of them out of the 100 odd families there are. And looking at it from the lens of the kind of society that we have, where it's still very much patriarchal, there's still a very strong kind of societal expectation that a family caregiver must be a man, that the breadwinner must be a man. A woman alone out there will have a very difficult life, discriminated or not taken seriously, and all this kind of problem. And you have to imagine that in this situation, add on to the kind of stigma that gets associated with the death penalty and all the crimes that those people have committed. Their family member who's a lone woman right now in the big bad world, so to speak, and the kind of pressure that they have and trying to survive at the same time, trying to figure out how do I get the best lawyer I can for my family member who's on death row. Now, when you add all these things together, sometimes I just look at these family groups and I'm amazed, right? Like, how do you get to where you are? How do you still find the energy to stand where you are right now and say, I still believe that I need to fight for my family no matter what they have done. I still believe in my love for them and believe that they can be a better person. And to a large extent, I think that just go to show the kind of endurance, the kind of strength that these people have. But at the same time, also every step of the way, no matter what question we ask, whether on your socio-economic circumstances, experience you have with lawyers, experience you have with state, you see the kind of more broader societal discrimination or the kind of vulnerability a woman is exposed to around them. And it's a tricky question to be had sometimes, right? Like, how do you even tackle this? Because it's not just a death penalty specific issue. It's a death penalty specific issue that is amplified further by this whole broad range of gender discrimination or lack of protection that's out there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dobby, for that great insight. Ajay or Ajay, do you want to jump in on this, or we can move on?
I think I'll let Aisha talk about this, especially from her experience, lots of experience representing death row inmates, and also talking with the family. But I guess from my side, when I when I still actively representing people on death row, I can only echo what Dobby has said. It's amazing to see how for many women whose families are involved in a drug offenses and or like sentenced to death for drugs, they are the one who they often become the one who um, further experience discriminations and burden into having to giving care for the family, become the money makers for the family, while at the same time taking care of their husbands or like family who are imprisoned. um, they are also stigmatized in the society for the family's involvement with drugs, or like because they were sentenced to death, sentenced for drug offenses, and most of the time they are also the one fighting for justice. And I think this Aisha, of course, can speak more about this, but like in Mary Utami's case, for example, it was her daughter who fought for her mother, for justice for her mother, and she, in addition to taking care of her own family, she talked and met with um, various organizations, talking with different people, trying to find ways to help her mom get out of this situation. Um, so, death penalty for drug offenses does not only affect women in the context of they are sentenced, they are more vulnerable and at risk of being sentenced to death, but also women whose families are at risk of being sentenced to death. Um, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ajay. Aisha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Ajay, for mention me many times. Yeah. So for Indonesia, we have Marutami as the example on how community and doctor lead the advocacy, including a public campaign. So talking about drug offenses, especially for women on death row, is not only about the client and the lawyer, but also the community and the family. So maybe Merutami as a good examples and how combine between the community, between community, religious community, family, and other activists across the issues and support her. And the other hand, we also have Meridian Veloso. Meridian Veloso has different situations with Merutami, while Merutami has a doctor to support financial for her, but Meridian Veloso is different. So uh, she has to work inside prison making batik to cover her health conditions, and then community will help them to sell her batiks. So maybe we also have to include the other actors in advocating death penalty abolishments. Yeah, maybe that's all.
Thank you very much, and yeah, really interesting to hear all three of you raise this sort of additional impact on women, and also how women often play pivotal roles in the advocacy efforts. Because when we were discussing this event with people, this was something which came up a couple of times. So another question that I'll open up to the three of you. Looking at countries where the death penalty has recently been abolished in some capacity, can you maybe touch on some lessons learned from here and how we can move forward in advocacy efforts towards abolition of the death penalty?
I can start. Probably, I guess, apart from the drug policy reform and the continued effort towards abolition of the death penalty in general, I think it's important to further sensitize lawyers and those involved in the criminal justice system on the gender vulnerability, and whenever relevant, to use it as a mitigating factors. Uh, in this patriarchal society, the gender vulnerability is often um, not taken into consideration by lawyers. They often and I talk based on my personal experience in Indonesia. Uh, they often more focused on the quote unquote the crime itself of like trafficking or selling drugs, but they don't talk with the women and ask them how they get there, what happened uh, in the past that lead to them, like what are the pathways that lead them to this situation. And I think it's not just a missing opportunity in defending clients, but at the same time it is also a bias against women who are involved in the drug trade. And I think for those who are not representing people directly, for those like me, for example, working mainly on research and advocacy, I think we need to talk about this more. We need to raise awareness on these issues more. Although women are, as I mentioned earlier, although there are at least 500 women on death row globally, it has rarely been researched or discussed or raised in the advocacy in the international advocacy efforts. How gender vulnerability leads women to this situation. So I guess the more we can discuss about this and engage in various advocacy opportunities to make changes to this situation would be better for the future.
Thanks, Ajeng. And Dabi, you're gonna go ahead?
Yeah. So I'm a bit of a pessimist when I come to this, because I mean, when we look at a lot of the kind of abolition that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, especially, a lot of them come from the African states, some from the oceanic states, and I think the dynamic in these places are quite different for the rest of us in Asia. Most of these states have not really been an active executing state for a while now. And relatively speaking, their state did not really have a strong history of championing the death penalty. Whereas when I look at Asia, we had China, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. All of us have, in one form or another, at some point or another, really became the forefront of championing the death penalty as a sovereign power, so to speak. And when I look at it, in the only two abolitionist states we have within the region, Cambodia and Philippines for the longest time. Cambodia has a lot of other problems, and the death penalty, fortunately, isn't one. But some of the problem makes the death penalty redundant. And when I look at Philippines, the death penalty has came back once, or at least once, I believe, and almost came back again in the recent years. And when I look at this, it's not only a lesson to say, we can learn from this country what we can do happen when abolition happens, but what can we do as a region, or what do we have to achieve as a region to ensure that when the death penalty is gone in one country in the region, it doesn't come back with vengeance, right? And when I look at this, my first thought is we do need a lot more interregional solidarity and also influencing one another. We have a tendency to influence one another for the worse, but not a lot of times that we influence one another for the positive, right? But to me, I think I'll draw the parallel to how the same-sex marriage or civil marriage is somewhat proliferating in East Asia, or how that has, what happened in Taiwan made South Korea and Japan look much, much closer at it. I'm hoping when it comes to the death penalty, we could do the same, right? Right now, Philippines have somehow managed to fight off the reintroduction of death penalty. Malaysia, we are scaling down death penalty with the abolition of mandatory. Indonesia just introduced their penal reform. And if all these things go well, what's the next step, and how should the current policy affect each other? Because like Malaysia, a good number of those on death row are actually Indonesian, and likewise, there's a healthy amount of Malaysian on death row in Indonesia. What can we do with one another, to ensure that the death penalty goes away soon, and when it does, it stays that way? Thank you.
Thanks, Dobby. And yeah, I would just definitely echo your calls for more international solidarity and collaboration on this topic. Um, Aisha, do you have anything else to add?
Yep, just a little bit. I don't know. Maybe some of us, especially in Asian region, um, do have tried to approach ASEAN Intergovernmental Conventions on Human Rights, or HR, to talk to every leader of the country to talk about death penalty abolition. So that maybe we can use this to do work in the future with ATPAN or with another organizations. So yeah, so means international solidarity. Maybe we can start from the our regions. Yeah, that's my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, so moving on to a final question and a little bit of a roundup. With everything we've discussed today, I'd like the speakers in one sentence to say how we can better ensure that the fight against gender-based violence includes fighting for those women facing the death penalty for drug-related offences.
Just one sentence. Uh,
I can give you two if you want.
no, I think just one sentence is fine. I think if anything at all, it's just it hasn't worked. It doesn't work. It will not work. Let's get rid of it. It also has a lot of problem. Gender is just another to add on to that power problem. So let's move on from it.
Ajang, do you have anything to say, or Aisha?
Um. Oh, okay. Okay. So one sentence. So, uh, gender-based violence approach prove that imposition of death penalty is always carried out by bad law proceeding, and gender-based approach save them from death penalty sentence. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ajeng just contacted me to say that her sound has gone. So I don't know, Ajeng, if you can hear me, but if not, then we'll wrap up. All right, she's going to reconnect, and if she comes back, then we can get her final thoughts. But yeah, I just wanted to thank all of the speakers today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and there's been a lot of insights into, I think, also the intersection of issues that are being faced by women sentenced to death for drug-related offences, including intersections with class and race, and it shows a lot of how we need to work very collaboratively on this topic. And I think, as Dobby put it very concisely, to just get rid of it. It doesn't work. We need it. We need it gone. So, yeah, thank you everyone for listening today, and thank you for thank you to the speakers. I know some people joined slightly late, so we'll try to make this event available online. I think it's been recorded, so if anyone wants to listen into the start or share it, then that'd be greatly appreciated. And we will leave it there. So yeah, thank you all.